I am Scott Shepard. I'm the pastor of Brandon's Chapel Baptist Church in the community of Stilesboro in Cartersville, Georgia. I've been there for 16 years. And I'm married to Katrina Cochran Shepard, and we reside in Adairsville. I was born and raised in Dalton. In about 1993, an evangelist from Nashville came to Dalton, and we were having a cup of coffee. And he said, Scott, in my estimation, the greatest preacher that ever came out of America was a man named Sam Jones. Have you ever heard of him? I said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, he was from Cartersville, and he's got a home down in Cartersville that's a museum. It's called Roselawn. You ought to go down there and go through it. And I said, Dr. Hunter, have you been through it? And he said, no, I haven't. I've always wanted to go. So that piqued my interest. I drove from Dalton to Cartersville, took a tour of Roselawn in about 1993, and just began to read about his life and ministry and the impact that he had. I guess the most interesting thing and most fascinating thing that I have found is probably what everybody else has found, and that is that in 1885, Sam Jones was invited to preach in a tent in Nashville, Tennessee that would seat thousands on the corner of Spruce Street and Broad Street, and he converted a very wealthy man in Nashville named Thomas Green Ryman to Christ, and Ryman built for him the Union Gospel Tabernacle, which would one day become the home of the Grand Ole Opry, the home of country music.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn for October at the Bartow History Museum. We're glad to have you out this afternoon. Let me give you a couple of upcoming announcements, and then we'll get started. A week from Saturday, next Saturday, October 26th, we're going to have a Sheep to Shawl event. We've got members of the Etowah Valley Hen Spinners Guild and the Peachtree Hen Spinners Guilds going to be here demonstrating the processes of taking the sheep to the shawl. So they're going to demonstrate wool washing, rinsing, drying, dyeing, seed, carding, spinning, weaving, knitting. You can imagine all those steps to take it from the sheep to what we're wearing. These two groups are the ones that we've worked with on the current temporary exhibit we have on the other side of this wall. I encourage you to check that out while you're here today also. But we do invite you to come out on the 26th to meet them and learn all about the life of wool. There's no evening lecture this month, October. If you look at your calendar, our evening lecture would be on October 31st. We decided to give you all the night off for trick-or-treating. In November, we've got on Saturday, November 9th, Old Fashioned Christmas event. It's our annual event where we bring in families and children, and Santa Claus himself will be here. So if you've got kids or grandkids, or you yourself want to have your photo taken with Santa, you too can do it. Those tickets are selling quickly, so I encourage you to go on our website and get that ticket soon. And then our next Lunch and Learn will be on November 20th. That's Wednesday, November 20th. We're doing something a little different this time. We're going to have a holiday show and tell. So we're going to pull out some unique artifacts from the collection that relate to Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, fall, those kinds of things. And we're going to show those to you and tell you about them. But then we invite you to bring one. Bring one of your treasures from home one of your favorite holiday memories or objects or Christmas ornaments or whatever it is you have that's special to you that you want to show it off to the group. Again, that's Wednesday, November 20th at noon. All right, well, without further ado, we'll get to our main event. Let me introduce Reverend Scott Shepard. I think most of us know Scott. He's a native of Dalton, Georgia. He's been the pastor of Brandon's Chapel Baptist Church in Stilesboro for the past 16 years. He's a PhD graduate of Trinity Theological Seminary, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation on Reverend Sam P. Jones. Reverend Shepard regularly speaks about Jones's life in Cartersville and the tremendous impact of his ministry during the 19th century. He and his wife, Katrina, wave your hand, is here, live in Adairsville, and we're glad to have you out today.
Thank you,
welcome.
Trey. Thank you so much. 71 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of a nation, three mothers welcomed 3 baby boys into the world in the year 1847, that 100 years after their births, they would all make front page headlines. The first was Thomas Alva Edison of Ohio, that invented the light bulb and electricity and lit the world. The next was Alexander Graham Bell of Scotland, who invented the telephone and made next-door neighbors out of the inhabitants of the world. The third little boy, born in the year 1847, that would make front-page headlines 100 years after his birth, was Samuel Porter Jones. The second-born son to John and Nancy Porter Jones, his mother's nickname was Queenie, because they said she carried herself regally. And he was born in Oak Bowery, Alabama, Chambers County, Alabama. And at the age of 5, he was not required to give a speech in school as the older boys were, but the older boys wanted Sam Jones to give a speech. So his teacher was W.F. Slayton, who one day would become the superintendent of the Atlanta public school system. But at the age of 5, he was Sam Jones's teacher. And so W.F. Slayton wrote a little trite speech for Sam Jones, and his mother, Queenie, helped him put it to memory. And it was late on a Friday afternoon, and he was asleep at his desk. They shook him and woke him up. W.F. Slayton carried him up to the stage, put him on a table, and this was his speech. "You would scarce expect one of my age to speak in public on the stage. In coming years and in thundering tones, the world shall hear of Sam P. Jones." Not bad for a 5-year-old, right? 4 years later, his mother died, devastated him, as it would any little boy or any little girl to lose your mother. This is what Sam Jones said: "My mother was a kind, painstaking, sweet-spirited Christian woman, but her gentle hand led me but a little ways. I was only 9 years of age when I stood by her casket in the parlor at home and stooped over and kissed her cold lips in death. I shall never forget that hour. The saddest hour in anyone's life is the hour they kiss mother goodbye. What is a home without a mother? No one can take her place. A boy never recovers from the loss of a kind, loving Christian mother." He remembered his mother always, and referred to her as "my precious mother." He said he never forgot the hour when his father took him and the other children into the parlor, and as a little boy he walked up to her casket, kissed her sweet lips cold in death, though at the time he was too young to realize the enormity of his loss. She sleeps in the old cemetery at Oak Bowery, Alabama. He was sent with his siblings to live with his Grandmother Edwards. And she had a tremendous influence on his life. She read the Bible through 37 times on her knees. And you can trace her lineage all the way back to the great Jonathan Edwards that sparked the first Great Awakening in America in the 1700s. If you remember, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" was his famous sermon. But she had a tremendous influence on his life. Sam's father, John, was an attorney, but he remarried a lady named Jane, or they referred to her as Jenny Skinner, in 1958. And in 1959, the children came to live with him in Cartersville. 2 years later, Sam Jones's father, John, would join the Army of Virginia with Robert E. Lee. And he grew up without a whole lot of parental supervision in Cartersville. He had a stepmother, but his father being gone had a tremendous impact on his life. These are the words of Sam Jones: "In spite of my mother's efforts, in the disordered state of society and country due to the presence of war, and for want of a stern hand of a father, I wandered away from the teachings of my sainted mother and the rules of my home. And when my father returned from the army, I had already taken the first steps in a worldly and wicked life. I had gathered words of profanity from my associates and begun the fatal habits of social drinking, and had reached the point in a young man's life when it is so much easier to drift on with the tide than to heed the warnings of loved ones. And in spite of the loving efforts of my noble father, I drifted on until at the early age of 21, I was physically wrecked and morally ruined. But for the absence of my father, which gave me liberty to associate with the wicked, I am sure I should never have gone to such excesses in vice. So he was somewhat of a rascal growing up in Cartersville. He rode a mule. He had a pet mule named Dave, and he rode Dave into church service one time while they were having service. Down the center aisle, around the pulpit, back down the center aisle, people were hooting and hollering. And people asked him, Sam, what were you thinking? I mean, what were you thinking to ride a mule into a church? And he said, well, I just despise a dull time. Well, word came that Sherman and his troops were just outside of...
On the computer.
Okay. So word came that Sherman and his troops were just outside of Cartersville on their way, and it fell to Sam Jones to go hide the horses that they had, and thank you, Trey, and go hide the horses that they had in hopes that when Sherman and his troops came through, they wouldn't steal the Joneses' horses. So his stepmother and siblings, they had picked out a spot where they were going to meet up, and they were going to get out of Sherman's way. Sam went to hide the horses, and he came back another way, and his stepmother and siblings, they left, headed south. Sam Jones missed his stepmother and siblings just by mere minutes, came back to the home, and there was a black lady there that they loved named Mammy Viney, and she was still at the house. He stayed with her for a few days, and then he made his way to Nashville. This young boy, let me just put a parenthesis there and say that this is Sam's father, John. These were his 5 uncles that all fought in the Civil War. One uncle was a chaplain. You notice the Bible. And uniquely, there were the only Jones brothers were the only 6 brothers that fought from Georgia in the Civil War. One was killed, one was shot twice and didn't die. So Sam Jones makes his way to Nashville. This is the earliest photo. Well, hold on. This is the earliest photo of Sam Jones that we know about. And so he makes his way to Nashville, and he falls in with some Union soldiers from Kentucky. There's a Captain Webb, and there's a Lieutenant Austin DuPay. They felt sorry for Sam Jones because he had been separated from his family and the loss of a mother. So he goes back home to Kentucky with them. Now, let me tell you what's going on in the Civil War. Amanda Liskey says this: children had been dealing with the trauma of the war from the beginning. Now likely they expected everything to return to the way it had been before. As fathers and other loved ones returned home, it had been a huge strain on the children to see how the war had changed them. A depressed and alcohol-dependent man may have replaced the once kind and loving father. Who is this man? What happened to Daddy? Alcohol had flooded America in the 1800s, and many citizens had been turning to spirits to drown their sorrows and to self-medicate their depression, especially following the Civil War. In 1823, the sour mash process was developed and revolutionized the product of bourbon, which is legally required in producing Tennessee whiskey. In 1860, there was 1,138 legal stills operating in the U.S., producing 88 million gallons of distilled spirits per year. After the Civil War, beer had replaced whiskey as preferred beverage of working men. Beer consumption had risen from 36 million gallons in 1850 to 855 million in 1890. So this is how Laura describes, as he goes to Kentucky, this Lieutenant Austin DuPay, his father, their property bordered the property of the McElwain's property. And so she was away at boarding school in Newcastle, Kentucky, and she comes home, and her mother introduces her to Sam Jones. And these are Laura's words. It was on a Friday afternoon, January 1864, that in company with one of my young girlfriends, it was my privilege to come home and spend the Sabbath. and from the boarding school in Newcastle, Kentucky, that I met this young man. When I got home, my mother was full of praises for Sam Jones, the Georgia boy who had come home with Lieutenant Dupay. And when my brother came, we were all delighted that he had brought with him to spend the night. And my first introduction to him was by my mother, who said, "Laura, this is Sam Jones from Georgia." I looked at him and saw a bright-faced boy with large brown eyes, and my heart went out to him in sympathy, for I had heard something of his history and separation from his family, from his mother. This was the first sight of the boy who was, in after years, to become my cherished companion, and whose name was to become a household word all over the land. He comes back to Georgia, and he enters the school of W.H. Felton and his wife, Rebecca Latimer Felton, who, of course, became the first U.S. senator in the nation. It was an honorary position for a 24-hour period of time. But Rebecca Felton said, when he was his wife Laura says, he was about 18 or 19, he entered the school, and she said, "Sam Jones was perhaps one of the most original men Georgia ever produced. He was kind and well-beloved by all who knew him. He was charitable, too, and responded to suffering always." After he left their school, he went to Harley High School in 1867. And here's where he says, "I suffered from the worst form of nervous dyspepsia." It's a stomach issue or a gastrointestinal thing. My health wrecked. With sleepless nights and restless days, I became discouraged and despondent and sought relief in the intoxicating cup. Oh, the horrors of nervous dyspepsia. Oh, the folly of seeking relief in the intoxicating cup. It was in this state of health and condition of mind that I began to study law, and in 12 months I was admitted to the Georgia bar, becoming more and more dissipated all the while. He had planned to go to college. His father had planned to send him to college, but because of his health, he was unable to go to college, so he studied law at home. After a year studying law at home in 1868, he was admitted into the Georgia bar. There was a Judge Milner in town that told John Jones, Sam's father, "You have reared the brightest boy ever admitted to the Georgia bar." He was just brilliant. He goes back to Kentucky to claim his bride. She's 18 years of age, and they have heard that he has started drinking. And so they have a very small wedding ceremony, and her father refuses to come to the wedding. But it's her mother that says, "You have promised this young man that you would marry him. He's come for you. You need to fulfill your promise." So this is what Sam Jones said: "When I was 21 years old, I was admitted to the bar to practice law in the courts of my county and state, and no boy in Georgia ever started out under brighter prospects than the man who is talking to you this afternoon. I was full of practice at the very first court that I was admitted to, and a week after my court adjourned, I took a northbound train in my hometown and rode to the bluegrass regions of Kentucky and married the sweetest girl that God ever gave to a Georgia boy, and I brought her back to my home with all the hopes of a future bright and pleasant." They welcomed their firstborn daughter on October the 31st, 1869, a little girl they named Beulah. In August of the following year of 1871, she died at 21 months of age. Sam Jones, to anesthetize the pain of the loss of a child, he turned to alcohol. And before long, he was a full-blown alcoholic. He couldn't practice law in Cartersville, so he took odd jobs, whatever he could do to feed his family. He was working at the Bartow ochre mines, firing the furnaces, and then he was running a stationary engine, but he lost those jobs at the Bartow mines because of alcoholism. He was relegated to driving a horse-drawn delivery wagon around town. They called a dray in those days for 50 cents a day. In August of 1872, Sam Jones's father, John, who he loved and respected and admired, was dying. And as Captain John Jones lay on his deathbed, his sick room was turned into a sacred chapel of ministry. And this is what John Jones said: This home that God has given me is filled with the glory of the Lord. I am physically very weak, but spiritually I am strong. When every other prop fails me, then Jesus Christ stands firm. As the end drew near, he called his family one by one and gave his parting words. When he came to Sam, the second oldest son, whose dissipation had greatly troubled him, he said, "My poor, wicked, wayward, reckless boy, you have broken the heart of your sweet wife and brought me down in sorrow to my grave. Promise me, my boy, to meet me in heaven." Under the deepest emotion, the son said, "Father, I'll make the promise. I'll quit. I'll quit. I'll quit." His grandfather, whom he was given the name Samuel, was a circuit riding preacher who preached for over 60 years. He went to his grandfather, the church where his grandfather was preaching at Felton's Chapel, and gave his heart to the Lord. And within about 3 days, he's riding in a horse-drawn wagon with his grandfather. Let me go to this. Sam Jones says, "I joined the church on Sunday, and the following Wednesday, my grandfather was just starting to go over to another church, and I got in the buggy and rode with him. And when we got there, the preacher that was to be there and preach for him was away, and my grandfather came to me and said, 'Sam, the preacher has just written to me and that he can't come and preach, and I'm so hoarse I can't preach. My boy, you'll have to preach tonight.' 'Well,' I said, 'Grandpa, I don't know anything to preach.' 'Well,' he said, 'if God has called you, you can preach.' I said, 'Shucks, you can't fool me. A man can't preach unless he knows something.' 'Well,' he said, 'you've got to preach, Sam.' Well, that settled it for me. He carried me up to the pulpit right there within 2 miles of where I lived, and the church was full of fellows that knew me. And he said, I took this text, and let me go back and show you this. 'For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek.' He said, the exegesis of my text was this: God is good, and I am happy in his love. He said that's all he remembered about his first sermon. Well, you would think that his wife would be thrilled that her husband had been redeemed. She was certainly thrilled that he had been redeemed because she had been praying for him. But when he told her that God had called him to preach, she said, I married a lawyer, I didn't marry a preacher. And he said, wife, I'm going to get on a train and I'm going to Atlanta to see if the North Georgia Methodist Conference will give me a place to serve. She said, you get on a train bound for Atlanta, I'm going home to Henry County, Kentucky. She said, I married a lawyer, I didn't marry a preacher. They had this discussion all week. The night before he's supposed to leave by train, as they're going to bed, he says, wife, God has called me to preach, and I believe he'll remove any obstacle that stands in the way. She said, he'll have to remove me then. They go to bed that night. In the middle of the night, she's calling to him. So he goes to her, gets her settled down. She goes back to sleep. Early the next morning, she comes in with a coal oil lamp before daylight, shakes him, and she says, Sam, get up. I've cooked a big breakfast for you. You need to eat breakfast. You need to get dressed, eat breakfast, and get down to the train station. You don't want to be late. You don't want to miss that train. She said, when I called for you last night, I thought I was dying. I thought God was going to remove me as an obstacle to your ministry. She said, now you go on, and if they give you a place to serve, I'll be the best preacher's wife that I can be, but I won't play the piano, and I won't speak in public, but you go on. So he goes to Atlanta, August 1872. The South has been decimated by the Civil War. There's no money in the South. And they assign Sam Jones the poorest circuit in the state of Georgia, the Van Wert Circuit, that was made up of 5 churches in 4 counties: Bartow, Paulding, Polk, and Floyd. As he's leaving the conference, another minister comes up and snidely says, Brother Jones, do you know what they paid the previous minister on the Van Wert Circuit? He said, no, I hadn't thought of that. He said, well, they paid him $65 for the whole year's wage. He said, well, I don't care what it paid or what it doesn't pay. I now have a place to serve the Lord, and I'm going there happy. So in 1872, he is hundreds of dollars in debt because of his alcoholism. He's got $8 to his name, a bobtail pony, and all of his worldly possessions will fit on one horse-drawn wagon. He loads up everything that he has. He makes the 22-mile trip from Cartersville to Van Wert. When he arrives at Van Wert, he is greeted with the news that we don't provide housing for the preacher. We don't have a parsonage. But there was a man that said, you know, I could rent you a house for $10 a month. Well, that's $120 a year. And they paid the previous minister $65 for the whole year's wage. Sam Jones said, we'll take it. Well, guys, there were some tough times on that Van Wert circuit. I mean, times they didn't have anything to eat. And you got to understand that Sam Jones, he preached against all sin, but he hated alcohol and probably preached harder against alcohol than anybody that's ever lived. And it stands to reason. I mean, it almost took him down to a drunkard's grave. It almost damned his soul. He would say things like, whiskey is a good thing in its place, and its place is in hell. He called it liquid damnation. Well, his wife Laura said, Sam, if you don't tone down your preaching, they will withhold their giving, and they'll starve us out. They'll starve us to death. He said, well, wife, if we do die of starvation, we will never give them the satisfaction of letting them know that they starved us to death. We'll just tell everybody we died of typhoid fever. Well, he kept preaching. People kept coming. And in 3 years, those 5 churches added 500 people. He brought in $700 a year for 3 years, $2,100 for 3 years. This was his first house. So, let me get back. This was his first house in Van Wert. This was the parsonage they later had, and then this is it today. I believe it's on Beauregard Street. I believe a black family lives there in Rockmart. This is the Van Wert Church as it stands in Rockmart. These were the circuits he pastored: the Van Wert, the DeSoto, the New Bern, and the Monticello. And those 8 years, 2,000 people joined the churches that he pastored in 8 years. So he always saw growth. Now, guys, they had a problem after the Civil War, a lot of orphan children. So the Methodists had opened an orphanage called the Decatur Orphans Home. Sam Jones had made a name for himself as being a prolific fundraiser. If you can take a $65 a year circuit and bring in $700, you can raise money. So Bishop McIntyre in December of 1880, approached Sam Jones and said, would you become the agent of the Decatur Orphans Home? So in the fall of 1881, Sam Jones officially becomes the agent of the Decatur Orphans Home. Now, what that does is that gives him more exposure to churches outside of our area of Georgia. In 1881, Sam Jones goes to Macon, Georgia. Sam Jones is a Methodist, but there's a Baptist pastor in Macon named Dr. Lamar, and Dr. Lamar falls in love with Sam Jones. He thinks he's the greatest thing that ever came down the pike. So as Sam Jones is going all over preaching and speaking on behalf of the orphanage, you got to remember the only mass medium of communication in those days were newspapers, magazines, and books. That's all they had. So the newspapers began to write about Sam Jones, and his fame started slowly to spread. Now, in 1883, Dr. Lamar from Macon has gone to Memphis, Tennessee, and has taken a church in Memphis. The city of Memphis is in a mess. They've got drunkenness and prostitution, gambling, crime, and the clergy of Memphis come together and they say, we need somebody that can come into Memphis and to shake our city for God. And Dr. Lamar, that has moved there from Macon, said, you men need Sam Jones from Cartersville, Georgia. And they said, who? Sam Jones. He said, I bet our two Methodist ministers, being Methodist, I bet you men, Dr. Steele and Dr. Mahone, I bet you men know about Sam Jones. They said, we've never heard of Sam Jones. Dr. Lamar from Macon says, he is the most unique man I've ever met. He's a sensation within himself. He said, if you get Sam Jones to come to Memphis, the only problem you'll have is having a place large enough to hold the crowds that he'll draw. Well, that intrigued him. So on Dr. Lamar's recommendation in 1883, Sam Jones is invited to Memphis. Well, he doesn't disappoint. The newspapers, in fact, Sam Jones said he was preaching in tents. But this is the Memphis Auditorium. Sam Jones said, the first revival I ever had which gave me newspaper notoriety was in Memphis, Tennessee in January 1883. Well, after he leaves Memphis, the city is still in a stir about Sam Jones. And T. DeWitt Talmadge, the pastor of the Brooklyn Tabernacle in Brooklyn, New York, he comes to Memphis. He hears all about Sam Jones and he says, well, I've got to have him in Brooklyn. So in January of 1885, Sam Jones preaches a month-long series of meetings at the Brooklyn Tabernacle in Brooklyn, New York. All right. In 1885, Nashville, Tennessee is nicknamed the Athens of the South. It has about 50,000 citizens. Sam Jones is invited to Nashville to do what he did in Memphis 2 years before. Sam Jones requests a tent that would hold 3,000, preferably 5,000. They balk at that and say, well, you're not really all that well known. We don't think that you can fill a tent to that capacity. He says, I tell you what, before I come in May, I will come in April and I'll preach in 3 of the largest churches that you have in Nashville. If I can fill those churches, surely that will warrant getting the tent that I've requested. So he goes in April, he packs the churches, people are turned away that couldn't get in. They relent and say, we'll have your tent for you in Nashville when you come back in May. So they erect this tent that would hold about 8,000 on the corner of Spruce Street and Broad Street in Nashville. So the newspapers are writing that Sam Jones has come and he's coming back in May. Tom Ryman was born in Nashville. He moved to Chattanooga. He moved back to Nashville. His father died. He had started making a lot of money selling fish to soldiers during the Civil War and was able to buy some steamboats. And he was a very wealthy man. And when he heard about Jones, he said, there's not a preacher alive that can make me give up my liquor. He was just making too much money. So Sam Jones starts this revival May the 2nd on a Sunday afternoon at 2:30 in 1885 under this tent. And he's preaching 4 times a day, every day for 5 weeks. To capacity crowds, overflow crowds. And he's having tremendous success. The newspapers are writing about him. Once he's been there for a little while, he begins to ask around, what's the key to this Thomas Ryman? And they said, what do you mean, Sam? He said, well, everybody has something that's near and dear to their heart. What is it with Ryman? They said, oh, it's his mother. He loves his mother. He has a godly Christian mother. May the 10th, 1885, Sam Jones stands under this tent to preach. Ryman has brought 2 rowdies with him. They've slipped under the tent. They're there to protect their interests. They're going to beat him up and run him out of town. Sam Jones knows why they're there, knows who they are. He says, I know there's some men that have come here tonight to whip me. If you men will just let me finish my sermon, when I'm finished, I'll step outside with you and I'll welcome the exercise. He said, I weigh 135 pounds. However, 132 and a half of it is solid backbone. And he preached that night on a boy's mother and the godly influence that a mother has on a little boy's life. Well, at the end of the message, Ryman starts down the aisle toward Sam Jones. Well, all eyes are on Ryman to see what he's going to do. When he gets down to the front, he sticks out his hand and he says, "Sam Jones, I came here tonight to whip you, but you have whipped me with the gospel of Jesus Christ." Well, he became the biggest fan Sam Jones ever had. He said, "Sam, if you'll come to Nashville 3 or 4 times a year, I will build you a building big enough to hold the crowds that you draw, and you'll never have to preach in a tent in Nashville again." And you guessed it, he built the Union Gospel Tabernacle, which was briefly named the Jones Ryman Auditorium, but when Tom Ryman died in 1904, Sam Jones went to Nashville to deliver his eulogy and said, "I suggest you drop the name Jones and let this building stand as the Ryman Auditorium," which of course became the home of the Grand Ole Opry, the home of country music. These were some of Ryman's 35 steamboats, and that was the home of Ryman. Very wealthy man. This is Sam Jones. He is preaching, if you can see in the middle here. It was before the balcony was put in at the Ryman Auditorium. This is a ladies' meeting. There are some men in the audience, but mostly ladies, and he is in the middle there speaking. Quit your meanness. This is an old hymn that was written in 1900. Jones defined repentance as being sorry for your meanness, that you quit doing wrong and determine upon the right. He said, if you want God to take hold of you, you quit. A lady once said to Sam Jones, "I have doubts that I've been saved." He replied, "Quit your meanness and you'll quit doubting." The Joneses and the Rymans became dear friends. These are pictures of them, their families together. Cottage days. In 1885, the Joneses buy Roselawn, 224 West Cherokee Avenue. A nice house, but not near as spectacular as it is today. They had a minister friend, Dr. T.R. Kendall of Louisville, Kentucky, who pastored Trinity Church in Atlanta, dedicate Roselawn at 2:30 on Christmas Day, with Jones praying that it would be a place where God could come and fill at home, a place with nothing to grieve away His Holy Spirit. Now, Sam Jones died in 1906. Prohibition, the passing of the 18th Amendment didn't happen until January 1920, but Georgia began allowing counties to vote on prohibition in 1885. So in June of 1885, prohibition passed by a majority of 2 votes in Bartow County. Sam Jones was conducting a tent meeting in his hometown in September of 1885, where School Street is today, 9 months after the county had passed prohibition. Jones had made some remarks during the meeting attacking anyone that didn't follow prohibition laws. Following the tent revival, most of the townspeople had gone home when an explosion shook downtown Cartersville. The Joneses' neighbors saw a fire raging from his Roselawn property, the Victorian home of Jones. A local outlaw named Tobe Jackson, who had been selling liquor since he was in his 20s, had used a dynamite charge to blow up Sam Jones's barn and now was on the run. Sam Jones had received a postcard that morning saying, "If you don't shut your mouth, we will put it under your house and blow you, your wife, and your children into eternity." He showed it to his wife, Laura, and Jones told his wife that it was just as near to heaven by the dynamite route as any. And he went to the tent and he preached that Sunday morning as never before. Fearless. Fearless. Let me say, in 1893, let me go back. In 1893, the Joneses bought a home in Marietta. Not because they didn't love Cartersville. In fact, when Sam Jones converted Tom Ryman, Ryman offered, he and some other businessmen in Nashville offered Sam Jones and his family a house and a lot in Nashville worth $10,000. And he declined, saying Mrs. Jones is very fond of her home in Cartersville. But in 1893, it was still a cottage. Roselawn was still a cottage. And they had outgrown it. And he traveled, of course, by train. And so in his way of thinking, if he lived closer to Atlanta, when he got to the state of Georgia, he could cut down on the train schedules. And if he lived closer to Atlanta, he could spend more time when he was in Georgia at home with his family rather than waiting on trains. So they bought this house in Marietta, didn't tell anybody they were going to move. So as time drew nearer for them to move, word got out in the community the Joneses are moving. Well, one night, almost at dark, there was a knock at the front door. Mrs. Jones went to the front door. The front veranda and the front yard were full of white people. About that time, they heard a noise at the back door. They go to the back door and the back veranda and the backyard are full of black people. The citizens of Cartersville have turned out to beg the Joneses not to move. So there was a friend of the Joneses, Warren Aiken. He was the unofficial spokesman for the white people, and he spoke for about 20 minutes, telling them how much he loved them and they didn't want him to move. But Laura Jones says that after he finished, it was the black spokesman that gave the most compelling argument. And this is what he said. Mr. Jones, we don't want you to move out of Cartersville because we feel that God has used you as an instrument to drive liquor from our community. And we fear that if you move away, we won't be strong enough to keep it out, and it'll come back, and it'll destroy homes and ruin lives. We don't want you to go. But if you must go, please don't take Miss Laura. He said she feeds us when we're hungry, she clothes us when we're naked, and she prays for us in our sorrow. Please don't take Miss Laura and the children. After that, they gave up any notion of moving out of Cartersville. So 2 years later, they raised Roselawn and built a new carriage house to the side of Roselawn. Now, to give you the impact of his ministry, this is the Cincinnati Music Hall. The great evangelist D.L. Moody deemed it the graveyard for evangelists. Nobody could go there and be successful, he thought, but 10,000 people packed that hall to hear Jones, with 50,000 turned away. How do you make 10,000 people hear you without a microphone or a speaker system? I know they built buildings acoustically back then, but the Toronto, he ventured a couple of times outside the United States to Canada, but other than that, he never left the continental United States. So the Toronto Globe reported that 6,000 people had joined the churches of Toronto during the Jones meeting of 1886. Now, I want to tell you, he was plagued by bad health his whole life. And he was preaching so much, he decided he was going to concentrate on the South. But after the arduous labors throughout the South, his health completely broke down, and he expressed in private and in public, "I am a dying man." So he began to lecture. He didn't charge to preach, but he would charge 25, 50 cents or $1 a head to come hear him lecture on the evils of the day. Now, today is Sam Jones's birthday. You want to know what Sam Jones was like? This is Sam Jones, right here. I was making a prohibition speech in Robertson County, Tennessee, and noticed on the right of the platform a blear-eyed, bloated fella who was about 3 parts drunk, each part a third. As I talked, he would screw his fist into his eyes and wipe away the tears. After the speaking, I went to a friend's house perfectly exhausted and lay down. The lady of the house called at the door in a few minutes saying that a man wanted to see me. "Tell him I'm tired," I said, "and please excuse me." "That is all right anyhow," she said, "because he is a drunken ragged vagabond. I said, well, if he's that sort of a fellow, let him in. I used to belong to that gang myself. And I never go back on them. The man came in and I found he was the drunken fellow who had listened to me speak. He said, Mr. Jones, I don't want any money. Money can do me no good. I'm a ruined man. Drink has made me a wreck. A short time ago, I had a happy home and a household. A few weeks ago, I buried my wife, having crushed every drop of blood out of her heart before she died. My 2 boys are at the orphans' home in Nashville. One of them is a little blind fella. My 2 girls are in Murfreesboro. And this, here he pulled out a little black cap out of his pocket, is the last thing that is left to remind me I ever had a household. It is my little blind boy's cap. Now, I don't want any money from you, but I just got an idea from the way you talk that maybe you'd have some sympathy for me. If you have, pray for me. Goodbye. And he started off, hold on here, I said. And I called up Mr. Taylor, my secretary, and I said, Frank, go uptown with this man and wash him all over with soap and put a new suit of clothes on him from head to foot and bring him back. In an hour or 2, he came back, and I did not know him. I had to be introduced to him over. I took out $1 and handed it to him and said, railroad fare in this state is 3 cents a mile. Here's $1. Now you get on a train and ride 33 miles, no matter in what direction, and get the conductor to put you off in the woods when you get 33 miles out, and then you strike out through the woods for a new life. That fellow did exactly as I told him. I got a letter from him the other day, and he said that he had gotten into the woods and struck for a new life. He got a school, sent for his children, rented him a home, and was doing well. A few weeks afterward, a first-class tailor took me into his store and gave me a $75 suit. I spent about $30 on that poor drunkard and made $45 clear. Why don't some of you fellows speculate that way? That was Sam Jones. Sam and his children, he had 4 daughters that lived and 2 sons. In a western town the summer before he died, he dropped into Walt Holcomb's room. Now, Walt Holcomb was a preacher that traveled with Sam, and he would marry Sam's daughter, Julia, the following year after he died. So had Sam Jones lived, it would have been his son-in-law. But he said he dropped in his son-in-law's, what would have been his son-in-law's room, pushed his shoes off and stretched out across the bed. He said, the other day after speaking, I was returning to my hotel when an old temptation that had been dead for years gripped me. I ran to my room, locked the door, and fell upon my knees, telling God that I could not withstand a stronger temptation than the one that had seized me on the street, and I would go down before it. The answer came in the lines of our grand old hymn, when through the deep waters I call thee to go, the rivers of woe shall not thee overflow, for I will be with thee, thy troubles to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. God seemed to say to me, you've passed through the darkest valley, pulled the steepest hill. The worst is over, the best is ahead. Walt Holcomb said, I heard him say, I will never feel myself entirely safe from a drunkard's grave until my wife kisses my lips in death, although God's grace sustains me. The summer before he died in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt was at the fairgrounds in Atlanta, and he brought Sam Jones up to the platform and said, Sam, you've been doing in a big way as a private citizen what I've tried to do as a public servant. 50,000 people applauded to the echo. This is the last photo of Sam Jones, 5 months before he died, 58 years old. For 21 years, he preached at a tabernacle, an open-air tabernacle where the library is today. The last sermon he preached there was September the 23rd, 1906. He stated over 20,000 people came to hear him. He had remarked many times that God was always close to him when he was in Cartersville among those he loved. He left there and went to Oklahoma to preach for 2 weeks. He begged his wife, Laura, to go with him. She rarely traveled with him, but he begged her to go, even though she didn't feel up to it. On October the 13th, 1906, Sam Jones preached his final sermon entitled Sudden Death in Oklahoma City. He used the verse from Proverbs, he that being often reproved hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. During that powerful message, he spoke of how he would like to die like his father did, with all of his children around his bedside. Sam Jones said, I don't know where or when or how I will die. I may fall in the pulpit, I can't tell. I may die away from home, I can't tell. When I go, I will go home to God as happy as any schoolboy ever went home from school. He boarded a train and headed back to celebrate his 59th birthday on October the 16th, 1906. On October the 15th, he woke about 6:30 in the morning. He felt nauseous, got dressed, was having his shoes shined by a porter, a Pullman porter on the train, and was cutting up with him. And before the hot water got there, Walt Holcomb was sitting there. He tried to say something, but he couldn't get it out. The words died in his throat, and he fell over dead. He was about 51 miles outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, in Perry, Arkansas. They brought his body home. You'll see a picture here on the front of the train of Sam Jones they've put up. They brought his body to Cartersville, October the 15th, 1906. His body lay in state at the Capitol in Atlanta, mostly because of his work with the children's home. His final resting place, Oak Hill Cemetery. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Daniel 12:3. You better quit your meanness. In 1909, now, E.O. Excel was his chorister. They didn't call him song leaders, but he was his chorister, as Sankey was to Moody. And in 1909, Sam Jones had been dead for 3 years. But Sam Jones had made a remark about being in heaven and when we've been there 10,000 years. And so in 1909, E.O. Excel prints Amazing Grace and the world-renowned hymns with added harmonies and an altered third-line melody bringing out the phrase, "But now am found." And the inclusion of a new fourth stanza, "When we've been there 10,000 years," not written by John Newton. This version with Excel's musical amendments becomes the standard version of the song. Count Nicholas Ludwig van Zinzendorf told his Moravian missionaries, "Preach the gospel, die and be forgotten." Perhaps Sam Jones wanted to serve the purpose of God in his own generation, die and be forgotten. Throughout his brief 58-year life, Sam Jones let his light shine for Jesus Christ, and he cast a long shadow for good over the countless lives of many in this great nation. His light for Christ continues to shine. Following his death, the Methodist Church in his hometown would be renamed in his honor. Roselawn, his beautiful Victorian home, now stands as a museum owned and operated by Bartow County and is referred to as the crown jewel of Cartersville. And let me just add, the best thing that's happened since Bartow County bought Roselawn is Miss Jane Drew.
Yes.
She's the best thing that has happened. Bartow County owes her a debt of gratitude, and I'm not just saying that because she's sitting here, and I'm not just saying that because I love her. That's the truth. Furthermore, every year thousands of tourists travel to Nashville, Tennessee to tour the Ryman Auditorium. Jones could have never imagined that when he died in 1906, the tabernacle that his most famous convert and friend, Tom Ryman, and of course he considered Tom Ryman to be the brightest jewel in his heavenly crown, said no greater convert to God in the 19th century than Thomas Green Ryman. Built for him in 1892 would one day become the home of the world-famous Grand Ole Opry. In coming years, and in thundering tones, the world once again needs to hear of Sam P. Jones. Thank you for your time.